Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy book webinar. Today, I am extremely pleased to have Dr. Thomas Wright with us, an author of the recently released book, Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics and the End of the Old International Order. Dr. Wright co-authored Aftershocks with Dr. Colin Kahl, the former co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and he now serves in the administration as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Dr. Wright is a leading voice on U.S. strategy, foreign policy, and the emerging risks to the international order. He serves as the director of the Center for the United States and Europe, and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. He's also a contributing writer for The Atlantic and a non-resident fellow of the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He is the author of All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, which was published by Yale University Press in May of 2017. Thank you so much, Tom, for being with us today, and congratulations to you and Colin on your new book. I really thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It is definitely one of those reads grounded in collective experience, historical context, but it also presents a series of pivotal insights about a framework for the post-COVID era. So thank you so much for being on with us today. Before we start, I'd also like to thank our audience members for joining us. This is a live discussion, but we will be sure to upload a recording to Newlines Institute's for Strategy and Policy's YouTube page for posterity. And additionally, if audience members would like, they're invited to submit questions for Dr. Wright to address by commenting to this Twitter Live at Newlines Institute's handle at NewlinesInst. So, Dr. Wright, I'd like to start off with a question. It's pretty simple, and it's what prompted you and Dr. Kahl to write this book and how you both approached the writing process. So back in 2016, following the presidential election, you published All Measures Short of War, which explored the international system amidst revisionist powers. And in All Measures Short of War, you outlined how the U.S. should pursue a strategy of responsible competition to navigate these challenges. But now, reflecting 5 years later, was the failure of responsible competition, was that compelled you to write Aftershocks? Or rather, was it the emergence of new challenges in the international system?
Well, firstly, Caroline, let me just say thank you for having me on, and it's great to be with you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and congratulations on everything the Institute is accomplishing. And let me just, I guess, start with answering your question that, we didn't have any, I wasn't planning on writing a book sort of at the beginning of 2020. When COVID struck, I think pretty clearly early on, it became obvious that this was going to be a major event, equivalent to or maybe surpassing, the international financial crisis of 2008-09. And so it's one of those moments, I guess, when you realize you really have to look closely at what's happening and try to place it in context, because we're seeing sort of history unfold before us. And I wrote an essay for The Atlantic trying to sketch out some very early thoughts on what the geopolitical implications of this would be. Colin wrote a piece on the same sort of a similar topic for War on the Rocks. And then we talked. We've known each other for quite a while, and we talked, and he suggested maybe we should write a book together on it. And when we talked about that, a lot of people were writing at the time about, COVID spells the end of this or the beginning of that. And what we sort of agreed on pretty early on is we wanted a book that would be, definitely get into some of that, but would be much more on critically analyzing what was actually unfolding before us. We wanted an analytical narrative of 2020 and to try to talk to officials as the crisis was unfolding. So, we talked to a lot of sort of officials at various points throughout 2020, and, their sort of views not changed, but evolved as the crisis evolved and as it went through its ups and downs. And then we try to place that in the context of here's what that means, sort of going for policy that's sprung with the crisis, and that's what. You're still sorry. And you're still muted, I think. So.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. Sorry, Tom. I think you were breaking up a bit towards the end there, but you're absolutely right in that now the phrase 2020 and posterity, I think it's going to hold so much weight. It's just one of those years now that when it's said and when it's stated in the history books, everyone will know that this is related to the COVID-19 pandemic, that it has the capacity to change how states behave in the international system. And, in the book, in Aftershocks, you and Dr. Kahl note that 2020 is joining this list of years, for example, 1914, 1939, 1945, 2008, not only because of the pandemic, but because it is, as you quote, it hit the world at the worst possible moment when multilateral cooperation is already suffering. And you both write that many leaders weren't even speaking when the pandemic hit. The pandemic was just something that exacerbated some of these pre-existing issues, adding a new layer of international non-cooperation. And you state how pandemics, much like great influenza and other international catastrophes, how they magnify these underlying forces between and within countries. And so my next question is, do you think, with or without this pandemic, hypothetically, that this trajectory of non-cooperation and the unraveling of the international liberal order could have been prevented? Or that this was an underlying problem that was just accelerated by COVID-19?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think you framed it sort of perfectly in the point we try to get across in the book is in that, and this feeds into the first question too, in that this was a unique moment because it was a global crisis in a time of nationalism and great power rivalry, and we haven't really seen that since the 1930s. And so I think 2020 is going to be one of those years that is studied, for decades to come. Even if sort of the world situation dramatically improves, it will always stand as an example of how the international order performed when really there was an absence of leadership, and you had sort of nationalisms and authoritarianism sort of around the world, sort of setting the pace in China, and elsewhere. So I think that is that's definitely a key sort of puzzle we try to resolve. I think what's interesting to me, interesting to both of us, was that, if you set aside Trump and you set aside populism and all of that, you do have this very interesting sort of phenomenon in China where, China put in place reforms after SARS in 2003. It was assumed that that would make them more cooperative, more transparent. We've always told ourselves that with transnational threats, the world should sort of cooperate on those issues. And when COVID hit, China, of course, was quite secretive and not cooperative with the international community. And then, frankly, not to draw a comparison, because I think they're very different, and what China did was on a much greater scale. But in much of the rest of the world, governments also hunkered down. And any plans they had for multilateral cooperation sort of went out the window. Now, that's pretty easy to explain in Trump's case because of his disposition and worldview, but it's harder in the European case. Europeans are sort of interesting to study on this because they were incredibly slow to recognize the dangers of the pandemic. And then once it hit, it was like every nation for itself. Now, they did recover somewhat in the summer, and they had a breakthrough on sort of fiscal integration. And then they had a problem again in the fall with the vaccine development and some complacency about COVID. But I think this crisis really threw everyone, for a loop. And I think what it told us is that, we can come back to this later on, I guess, in terms of the conclusion of the book, but it really reminds us we need a plan to deal with these threats in the world that we have, right? We can't just assume let's fix the world and have everyone cooperate, because they just didn't. And so what can we learn from what happened that will better inform, policy decisions for the future, being cognizant of real sort of political constraints. Carolyn, you're on mute again, sorry.
You're totally fine. I think that's a really great point, given that I think right now, as we start to recover from the pandemic, and also as we start to face the Delta variant, I think there is a bit of COVID fatigue. But this is also a crucial time to uncover and contemplate some of the takeaways from the COVID-19 pandemic and the lessons learned. I also want to quickly take this moment to welcome any new viewers to this Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy book discussion with Dr. Thomas Wright, the director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution and the co-author of the book Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics and the End of the Old International Order with Dr. Colin Kahl. If you'd like to ask Dr. Wright a question about his book, about the COVID-19 pandemic and the trajectory of the old international order, please make sure to comment to this live tweet, message, or tweet at Newlines Inst. And that leads me to my next question. As you mentioned, some of the autarkic behaviors and the independent foreign policy trajectories of some of these state actors. And in the book, you mentioned this in a number of different situations, particularly with the Trump administration and how they interacted with other countries and former allies. The COVID-19 deteriorated the transatlantic partnership. In the book, you offer an example of how at the start of the pandemic, when European leaders sought to use the G7 summit as a mechanism for coordinating economic recovery and assistance, there was a disconnect with Washington. And you and Dr. Kahl mentioned that while many EU countries would have been okay with following the US's lead, there was, and you quote, no US to follow, speaking to the Trump administration's ad hoc and sometimes disjointed strategy. And you mentioned how Europeans were quite surprised that there was no contingency plan and that the White House got caught up in sometimes with semantics, what to call the coronavirus pandemic, that really hindered any consensus for a G7 joint declaration. But at the same time in the book, you also talk about how consensus was already fractured in the international system, despite who was in the United States White House. And, when discussing this as a historical trajectory, you mentioned that foreign powers, both the victors and the vanquished, looked to the US as a pivot of the new order, but this time it was no longer the case. And I'd like to ask, especially in the context of the past 3 to 4 weeks with the withdrawal in Afghanistan, what is the viability in the future of a US-led liberal international system? Do you think that this quote, no US to follow, summarizes the coming years of a new international order?
It's a great question. And, just to step back a second to 2020, I think what you have with the Trump administration is, they actually figure out early on that COVID is a threat. In fact, earlier than many European countries, or pretty much any European country. And that's because there are certain individuals who I think have a background in this in the administration, like Matt Pottinger and others. And obviously there are very high profile sort of medical experts like Fauci and Redfield who are sort of raising the alarm. They then convinced Trump to do a travel ban at the end of January. But then Trump sort of washes his hands of it and thinks, I've done my part. That's all fine now. I don't need to do anything else. And so those people who are worried about it, who really think it is a rerun of 1918, 1919, are sort of running around saying, no, we really have to prepare. Now, no preparations were really made domestically. And then in March, Trump realizes that the situation is very serious. He has to shut down, the economy. And he turns around and immediately sort of blames China in a fury. And then the response becomes defined by sort of seeing the pandemic as a China challenge, as it were. There is really no, significant international leadership, at that point. Like China, has not cooperated with the rest of the world, and it has some aid and assistance, but it comes with strings attached, and it's for its own strategic, ends. European member states, EU member states are just turning in on each other, at this point. And so that all really drifts. And I think, you do really need sort of the US to be playing a very significant role on a whole bunch of things, including, coordinating restrictions, sharing information, starting investments on diagnostics and testing, and of course the vaccines, and thinking about how this is implicating the developing world, working within the WHO, all of these things. None of these things happen. And there's really no one to fill the gap. I mean, Europe tries a little bit, but is not capable of doing so. So I think that, just looking forward, I think what it really sort of shows is that the US has a particularly vital role to play. Now, the point we make in the book is that the US can sort of go ahead and do that with like-minded countries, and we can come back to this later on, without waiting for everyone else, because it's sort of a race to the top, right? But in terms of your question and what it means for everything else, I'm not sure I sort of would agree there's a full sort of comparison there. I think Afghanistan, was sort of a sui generis, sort of case, and I think what's really happening is Biden is trying to sort of shift, one can agree or disagree with it, but he's trying to shift the US focus to a new set of issues, more focused on the Indo-Pacific, more focused on major power issues, on tech, on the future of democracy. And that's where he intends to try to lead, right? He doesn't really want to be having this sustained, obviously, military, engagement in Afghanistan. So I think they wouldn't see it as sort of a full-scale sort of retrenchment. But I do think on COVID, while Biden has done quite a bit, I think, the US and Europe and other democracies still need to do much, much more, because this is a global challenge and we are currently falling short on that, right? So it's not enough to do more than the last team and to say this is sort of an unprecedented sort of investment. We have to do what is required in order to solve it. And I do worry that collectively we are not currently doing that.
Absolutely. And I, in the book, you certainly mentioned that in the framework, the prescribed framework for a post-COVID era. I also want to talk about the void that you just previously mentioned, about how the United States can offer services and leadership, and when the United States is not there to do so in the instance of, the COVID-19 pandemic, then there is going to be a lot of, confusion and kind of chaotic management. And with the G7 as an example, throughout the book, that was a moment where many US allies and partners recognized that this was a crisis where every nation was for itself. And whether the United States assisted or not with vaccine distribution, scientific innovation, and other forms of assistance, we're still witnessing this rise in autarkic policies, nationalist impulses, and the early signals that the old international liberal order is coming to a close. We see this, of course, with the rise and emergence of liberal leaders and autocrats who exploited the pandemic to consolidate control and erode democratic norms, while the COVID-19 crisis was also exacerbating great power competition. This is also a theme that you touched upon in your last book, All Methods Short of War, All Measures Short of War. But since then, I want to ask, what has fundamentally changed with the liberal actors? Are they posing new kinds or new levels of threats to the United States' interest and also to the aging international liberal order?
The liberal powers?
Yes, the illiberal powers and revisionist powers as well.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the threat and challenge has evolved since All Measures Short of War came out. I think one thing I didn't sort of anticipate in that book was the degree to which this has I talk about it a bit, but the degree to which it's become a competition of governance systems, that there is some ideology involved, and also the degree of election interference and political interference. largely came after the book was finished. There was a bit of that, but not nearly as much as I think there was. I think what this, though, crisis sort of shows is it's less that I think the intention of the Chinese government and of Xi Jinping was to actively harm sort of the US. It was that his and their visceral sort of instincts and impulses was to act in a way that caused great harm to the international effort, right? So it wasn't an intentional sort of act of aggression or something directed against the US. It was largely a means of regime survival and protection in Xi Jinping's mind, I believe, and then, of course, afterwards, when the virus was largely suppressed in China and in Wuhan, he became more assertive and believed that this was a vindication of sort of the Chinese system, that the US was in decline because it was flailing around trying to deal with the virus. And so we did see more intentional behavior sort of after that point. I think they're coming out of this not believing that this was a failure on their part. I think they see it largely as a vindication. And that's very, very concerning, because if you look in the US, I mean, not everyone, obviously not Trump, but many people believe that this period was a failure, including Republicans, believe that many mistakes were made. We spoke to many of them for the book, some Trump officials, and they'd be quite frank and honest that, they made major errors and major changes are required. But if China's coming out of this and they don't actually believe that major changes are required, then I think we really are sort of in trouble. And I think the larger point, Caroline, too, is that it sort of demonstrates that we have these shared challenges and threats. They affect us all. But actually, it's going to be incredibly difficult to cooperate on them together. And so we should try to do that for sure, try to improve that for sure. But what do we do, if that breaks down? And I think that's the real, sort of question coming out of, this whole period.
Absolutely. I would like to quickly take this time just to thank our audience members tuning in. Also welcome any new audience members that have joined this Twitter live session with the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy and our discussion with Dr. Thomas Wright, the director of the Center on US and Europe at the Brookings Institution and the co-author of the book Aftershocks, along with Dr. Colin Kahl. If you'd like to ask Dr. Wright a question about his book, about the COVID-19 pandemic and the trajectory of the old international order, please make sure to comment on this live tweet, message, or tweet at Newlines Institute. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about the blueprint, the prescribed blueprint that you and Dr. Kahl write about in the book that is moving forward in relation to great power competition, and also trying to incorporate some of the lessons learned, as you mentioned, from the COVID-19 pandemic. You and Dr. Kahl acknowledged that there is this debate about what there is perceived as existential threats to the international liberal order. It's either revisionist powers such as China and Russia, or transnational dangers like climate change and pandemics. But you both note that we can incorporate both into a blueprint on how to proceed, and that in order for the United States to navigate them, Washington has to harness critical domestic bipartisan consensus to A, identify the lessons learned from the pandemic, and B, make key investments that spur innovation to both build resiliency against these transnational threats like climate change and pandemics, but also to compete with these great power rivals like Russia and China. And so with the Biden administration, there has been a clear emphasis and a call to return to this transnationalism and rebuilding US ties. But what would you further prescribe? Have we laid down a solid foundation for this? And what room is there to grow and to really make this a key strategy of the United States, not only for this administration, but for the ones after the Biden administration?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I just answered in a few ways. I think domestically, what we need to do is several things. One is we need to build a national consensus that pandemics are a serious threat that have to be addressed. And that sounds obvious, but it is very concerning, I think, that since summer of last year, a lot of people on the Republican side including, the governor of Florida and others, have basically sort of dismissed the whole thing as overblown. And it would be a terrible error, I think, if any party or group of people was to come out of this period and think the lesson for the future is not to overreact, right? That actually is not as bad as it seemed, because whatever one thinks of COVID, and I think obviously we think it is a huge sort of threat, continuing sort of threat, and was a major event. The next pandemic could easily be worse, right? The lethality rate of the 1919 influenza was higher than this. There's no reason this could not have been higher also. You could have something as infectious as Delta, but much more lethal, and which would be a total sort of game changer. And so it's really important we don't sort of lose any time. And I think it's, I don't know, we suggest in the book, I mean, it's often trotted out in situations like this, but I think it would be useful. It's sort of a national commission on pandemic preparedness that would enlist many of those Republicans, including Trump Republicans, who actually did call the virus correctly and did see it as a major threat. I think in terms of the strategic concept, I mean, you referred to this in the question. I think we need to recognize that we're facing near worst case scenarios on pandemics and transnational threats on the one hand, and major power rivalry on the other, compared to what was expected a decade ago. And there's a negative synergy between those two things, right? Each affects each other and makes the other worse: great power rivalry and sort of transnational threats. And we have to deal with the world in which both are true simultaneously. We can't just say, let's set aside great power rivalry and engage with China, because that's not going to work. And we can't just say it's all about China, let's not really worry about the transnational piece, because that's not going to work. And so we need something that integrates those two. And that brings me to the third point, which is the more international component. And I referred to this a few times earlier, that we need a plan, that will work even in a broken world. For us, we say, let's engage in the WHO, let's try to reform the WHO, but let's not count on that happening. And so let's put together an alliance of like-minded countries. We call it a global alliance for pandemic preparedness, in which the US and other like-minded countries, or if the US is not in that camp at that particular point in time, other countries can simply do more than everyone else, invest more in global public health, in vaccines, in diagnostics and testing, in working with the developing world, adhere to greater levels of transparency, commit to greater levels of coordination and cooperation in the event of a crisis. And if a pandemic does hit in the future, maybe those countries can act early in unison and then put pressure on countries that are not doing so. So this will be a sort of complementary to the World Health Organization, not undermining it. It would be alongside full US membership and engagement. And I think that for us is a way to ensure that this great power competition in a time of pandemics is sort of a race to the top, not sort of hunkering down at the bottom.
That is a really great point, which brings me to my next question. You discuss kind of these informal coalitions or mechanisms for discussion where these, where international actors can come together to discuss aid, recovery, but then also new strategies on how to counter future pandemics. But this brings me to a question about the basic institutions that were thrown into disorder from the COVID-19 pandemic, which has prompted many of stakeholders to question these institutions' basic viability and the purpose of some of these institutions. This was evident, for example, when the EU, the Northern and Southern blocs, they locked horns over pandemic economic assistance and threw the union into crisis. And while certainly they were able to, to get over some of these obstacles, a lot of EU members and internal blocs really did question the viability of the European Union. And so I think that you in the book, you and Dr. Kahl, you note that this is going to be a long-term problem. You also note that there is an irony to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's, despite the international system having the most institutions and organizations and forums to address the pandemic and other crises, nations were still trying to do this their own way and pursue independent policies. And so this brings me to a question, and you discuss this a bit in the book. Do you think this parallels a period in the 1930s where you have the Manchurian crisis, you have the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, which reduced the League of Nations credibility and legitimacy due to weak enforcement? And so do you think that this is a moment that could, for example, parallel the League of Nations in the mid-1930s? Do you think institutions like the EU, the UN can recover from this? Or do you think that they could potentially slide into a more defunct role? And this, of course, goes hand in hand with the growing trend of liberalism in the international order.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility. It's probably less of a possibility now than it was maybe 12 to 15 months ago, because I think it is a choice. And I think if actors make the wrong decisions, what started out as a pandemic in a time of nationalism and rivalry could easily sort of unravel the whole system unless they take steps to prevent that from happening. I think if Trump had been reelected, I think it would have been very, very difficult internationally to have any sort of sustained cooperation. The US definitely would have left the World Health Organization. It probably would have seen other exits as well from other institutions and treaties. There really would be very little, if any, sort of coordinated action, internationally. And I think on global public health, and what he did would, politically would have given support and encouragement to other autocrats and wannabe autocrats sort of around the world. So I think that was something that, had the election gone a different way, then maybe we'd be on a different trajectory. And in the EU, and we sort of write about this in the book, that the EU did come close to sort of an existential crisis. Now, they realized that and they acted to prevent it from happening. And they agreed on fiscal, on mutualization of debt and other fiscal measures. And that helped a lot. And they messed up on the vaccine development, but they managed to recover sort of in the spring. And so what we saw there was more corrective behavior by the EU. But had they not done that, had those summits gone a little bit differently, then I think it would have, jeopardized the very future of the EU. And certainly that's what Merkel, Macron, and others believed at the time. That's one of the reasons they acted sort of in the way that they did. So I think that this crisis had that potential, and to some extent it still has the potential. One thing I worry about is, with this inequity in global vaccine distribution, we could easily end up with sort of turbocharging global inequality, because you have like one part of the world that's quote unquote safe and another part of the world that is not. And, they just go in different directions, and there's all sorts of barriers thrown up under the name of health measures, but it cuts along certain socioeconomic and ethnic and political lines, and that will have a very damaging sort of effect. So I think we can prevent that outcome from occurring, but this is the type of crisis, I think, that could easily, lead to a more general unraveling.
No, absolutely. And another question building off of that as well is, as much as this pandemic has exposed the shortcoming of our international system, for example, highlighting the vulnerability of supply chains, alliance systems, democratic norms, it also exacerbated a lot of disinformation, polarization, extremism in some cases. And so moving forward and trying to build the necessary consensus that will be needed for the United States to preserve its interests and protect this international order, there are a lot of challenges ahead. And it could be likely that while the United States tries to pursue a strategy countering digital authoritarianism, infrastructure and energy coercion, military aggression, enforcing cybersecurity, that the policy might have some holes in it, and that the United States will not be able to achieve all of its objectives. So non-cooperation could be a permanent mainstay in the international system. And you say that we could be seeing the beginning of the demise of the old international order. Do you think a new order will take its place? Or do you think that the United States still has time and is still in a position to change the course of where the international system is headed?
Yeah. So just one point, I guess, just on the start of that, and then I'll get to the later part, which is very important also. What's interesting about 2020, Caroline, I think, in one way, is that lots of things broke down. Some things did not, right? So some things actually worked pretty well, and surprisingly so. So on the financial side, the central banks basically acted to prevent a financial meltdown. They were very worried about a financial meltdown. They thought they were on sort of the brink of an abyss, as one Federal Reserve official put it to us. But that was averted. They acted in an enormous way. Other central banks also acted, ECB and some others. And there was very little formal coordination or cooperation to do that. The officials described it to us as correlation without coordination. So you just had all these actions that mutually reinforce each other. And so that, I think, was sort of interesting. If you told people 5 years ago that the G7, the G20, the IMF, all of these things would sort of break down and not really work, or wouldn't be used, and you'd have leaders that weren't that interested, they'd probably predict catastrophe, right? But actually, sort of unilateral action ended up being sort of enough, because the interests were largely aligned. Vaccine development is another one, right? Where, COVAX didn't really work, but the US effort to develop a vaccine sort of did, by just throwing enough money at it. It did sort of achieve its objective. So it was a mixed picture. Like we're not trying to say that everything, fell apart. I mean, certain security crises that might be expected did not occur. I mean, China definitely became more assertive, but in other parts of the world, things are relatively quiet. So I think there was there was a lot of chaos, especially at certain points. But it was also sort of revealing, just in terms of what worked and what didn't. Looking ahead, I mean, why we say this is the end of the old international order is really, it's the end of a period in which we might reasonably expect major powers to cooperate on these challenges because they have them in common. And, that while we should still strive for that period looks like it is sort of over at this point, and that we do need to prepare, to have a backup plan if that doesn't work, and that the era in which the US is relatively uncontested in these institutions is also over. So we still see a very important role for the United States and for the US to lead on these issues. In fact, in many ways, we see that as indispensable. But we think that's going to sort of change. How that plays out will change because of the geopolitical context.
Just to follow up to that, in defining what is next and the void that the United States, its partners, and also its adversaries are going to fill. Now that we're pivoting from this period, like you mentioned, where shared experiences compel the United States and partners to work together, to build consensus, to collaborate, to coordinate. Are we going to move to a system where it is now just based on individual geopolitical interests? Will alliance systems really have a lot of weight like they once did? Or do you think it's going to be a more ad hoc system where, sure, we could have these coalitions, we could have these forums for coordination, but they may not necessarily carry as much weight as they did?
Well, we need both, like we need the WHO. We need the WHO to work sort of more effectively, and we have to have a real sort of lessons learned approach on this and just try to strengthen the WHO. But ultimately, the WHO can't defy sort of its major member states for a long period of time. And so they will run into some difficulty. And so we also have to, push for higher levels of transparency, cooperation, coordination, and investment, even beyond what they would commit to. And, we haven't mentioned this yet, but this crisis, the IMF estimates it will cost the global economy $22 trillion between the start of it and 2025. And, we're often debating, billions of dollars in the single digits of billions about investing in this or that. That's all sort of pennies on the dollar in terms of the overall picture of what this has actually cost. And so I think what we need to do is sort of change our mindset to, to be willing to make those necessary investments and commitments. Now, whether or not that happens globally or nationally, I think, is something that we'll have to figure out. But just to give you one example, if you look at the vaccine development at COVAX and all of that, if you had a centralized approach to developing a vaccine, it probably would have got bogged down into who's contributing what and countries not wanting to pay, disproportionately large amount compared to others. And you'd probably get into lots of sort of, budget issues. In the end, and I think the Trump administration deserves some credit on this, the US just investing over $18 billion, didn't need to wait for anyone else. That actually made a big difference. And so what is it that we can have coordinated action from like-minded countries on, in a positive, affirmative sense of it? And we're seeing a little bit of that sort of on the vaccine side. But I do think we need all of the above. We definitely, in the book, we're very strongly in favor of multilateral engagement and working within the WHO, but we also think, it's important to go beyond that all too.
No, absolutely. And it looks like we do have a question from one of our audience members. So it says, thanks, Tom and Caroline. Much of this discussion is framed around how COVID-19 is presented or has presented a crisis for multilateral cooperation. But how much do you think revisionist states have seen this crisis as an opportunity for competition and coercion?
It's an interesting question. I mean, China, I think, has, I don't know if they see it, they definitely acted in a way that suggests it's sort of an opportunity for them to increase their influence internationally. And we spoke about that a bit earlier, but I think that is, one of the defining sort of legacies of 2020 is this, is that it was quite revealing about China in different ways, right? In terms of its behavior early on, and then, of course, what happened in Hong Kong, and its attempts of coercion with Australia and other instances throughout the year. In terms of other countries, though, I think it's less about revisionism. It's more like, how did, Bolsonaro did terribly badly on the pandemic. And I haven't checked quite recently, but up until very recently, he was actually quite popular in Brazil still, right? So this is something you might expect to have discredited nationalism, populism, but it hasn't, because they are speaking to a significant portion of the population that's deeply frustrated with lockdowns and restrictive measures, and they are suspicious of some of the official stories. And so we need to sort of see where that goes. I wouldn't assume that, the Bolsonaros or, Orbans of the world or others will be weaker coming out of this. I don't think they're necessarily looking for opportunities. It depends on the actor. But I think they are in some cases coming out stronger. And, Trump, of course, lost the election, in 2020, but maybe not by quite as much as some people thought he might. So I think this domestic competition of systems between, more populist leaders and more classically democratic leaders, I think that's still very much alive sort of after this pandemic. And that's really interesting.
That was a great question posed by one of our audience members. And it's got me thinking, about also not only just nationalism, but also separatism and a lot of these different identities, they also had opportunities to grow more vocal in the pandemic. And I'm curious whether you also see that as a trend in this post-COVID framework and era. Do you think that, some of these nationalist voices, separatist voices, do you think that they're going to see this as a period where they can consolidate more influence, or do you think that it is going to kind of revert back to former models of control?
I think that the autocratic leaders have used this crisis to increase their control over their own populations and over their countries, and they've used surveillance technologies and other emergency measures to do that. That's happened in many sort of countries, including Hungary, but also others. And we write about that in terms of this sort of phenomenon about the use of technology for surveillance purposes and how that might be undermining democracy. And so that's one of those shocks that's sort of coming out of the public health crisis, that we see these ripple effects occur, and we don't know where they will go. I mean, if you look back to 08, 09, and Adam Tooze makes this point in his book Crashed. If you were assessing that crisis in 2012, it would look like populism and many of these forces had failed to materialize. But by 2016, 2017, it looked very different. So the further you got away from it, the greater the effect of the crisis, or you might expect it to be bigger at the beginning. So this will have a long tail, I think. And it's, and we make this point in the chapters on World War I and the Great Influenza, that there's a lot of contingent effects as well in terms of just accidents of history, how this sort of shapes it. But then also on the macro level, if we do have real economic problems coming out of this, that will have a strategic consequence, also. So my sense of it is that we are, that this will reinforce that sort of competition between sort of classical liberalism, democracy on the one hand, and sort of authoritarianism and nationalism on the other.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It looks like we don't have any other audience questions, but I would like to take this moment to thank our audience members for tuning into this Twitter Live series. And also thank you for those who have posed questions. This has been a really, really fascinating discussion. I would also like to let everyone know that Aftershocks, it is available on Amazon and a number of other bookstores and independent bookstores. I got this from Kramer's down the street near DuPont Circle. And it's an incredible book. I really enjoyed reading this. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for joining us. Congratulations to you and Dr. Kahl for a very great book, and of course writing during the pandemic, which I'm sure was a challenge. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone. You can find this video on Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy's YouTube site. We will have a full recording uploaded within the next few days. And of course, if you would like to read any analysis from the Newlines Institute, whether it's podcast, written content, or book talks like these, you can find them on www.newlinesinstitute.org. And thank you so much. Have a safe week and have a great Labor Day weekend.
Thank you, Caroline. It's been really great to be with you and with the audience. Thank you so much.